Welcome to Lair the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, I have a special guest joining me as we are going to be talking about difficult singer changes that succeeded. These are changes from a very popular singer that allowed the band to expand, change, maybe come out of a deep hole, a difficult change that panned out for the better and led to a new successful period for the band. So I'd like to introduce my guest here. He's been here at the Lair a few times before. Joining me from the shrimp on pizza capital of the world is Per-Ola. Thank you, Per-Ola, for joining me here again at the Lair.
Thank you. Cheers.
And just so everybody knows, the shrimp on pizza capital of the world is Jönköping, Sweden. All right, just so I get that out there. Okay, so this is a really interesting topic. Now, we're really kind of honed in on a very specific thing. We're going to be leaving out what may feel like some obvious choices, because our criteria for this is that when the other singer comes in, the band has to have some extended success with this singer. It has to, in some ways, move the band into a new phase, maybe a more successful phase of their career, but it's somebody who's around for a little while. For instance, we're not going to include on our list Dio taking the place of Ozzy in Black Sabbath. As much as me and P.O. love Ronnie James Dio, he was really only in Black Sabbath for 2 albums, a live album, 2.5 years, whatever that span was. He would come back in the 90s with Dehumanizer, but they didn't really have any kind of, long journey with Ronnie. So we love Ronnie. He was an amazing success coming in after. Hard to replace somebody like Ozzy, but it doesn't really quite fit our criteria here. Another band that comes to mind would be like Uriah Heep. After David Byron, Uriah Heep would move through a lot of different singers. And although there were a lot of good singers that came after David Byron, none of them really stuck around for long enough to say that it was sort of a long, successful new chapter for the band. Maybe you could say that with Bernie Shaw, the latest singer in Uriah Heep, as he's been in the band for quite some time. He might kind of fit this criteria, but so we're just putting that out there in case we leave out somebody that you think, how could they have left out this particular person? Well, we're sort of focusing and getting really sort of nitpicking here and real specific with our picks. And now Per-Ola is going to be taking the more metal side of these picks. I'm going to be taking the more rock side of the picks, although I do have one metal singer in my picks. So, okay, here we go. We're going to start with P.O. here. What's your first pick, P.O.?
My first example is Halloween. And I'm going to talk about the change from Michael Kiske to Andy Darius, which took place in the early 90s. And the first thing we gotta say and we gotta remember is that Halloween were actually huge. If only for a brief period. They were actually not just on the verge of a breakthrough, but they were huge. They had the most successful album, Keeper of the Seven Keys Part 2, 1988, so 1.5 million copies. They outsold Judas Priest. That's how big they were at that point. And so they were going to leave Noise Records. They were going to sign with EMI, and they signed for Rod Smallwood to manage them. And everything was looking good. They were big in Japan and whatnot. But they got caught up in a lawsuit with Noise Records, which held them. They couldn't do shit for like 2 years or something, and that was a long time back then. And when they finally got out of that, they lost a lot of momentum, and they made two more albums, Pink Bubbles Go Ape and Chameleon for EMI. And those were really expensive albums, but they had nowhere near the success of the Keeper of the Seven Keys albums, and especially this one, Chameleon, is a complete train wreck. It's got all sorts of weird shit except metal on it. It's got a song, all this sappy pop ballads. It's got kick horns, whatever you name it, and it was a complete flop. And EMI tossed them by the wayside. They were out of contract, no credibility left. Nobody believed in Halloween anymore. And on top of that, they had to change the lead singer because Michael Kiske left. So probably it couldn't get much worse from that point on. So what they did, there was they brought in Andy Darius. He had been singing for a glam band called Pink Cream 69. He had a completely different voice compared to Michael Kiske. He's got a raspier tone. He does have a good range, but doesn't have the high range that Michael Kiske had. But he had his own identity. He came out with a totally unique voice and didn't sound anything like a clone of the previous singer or anything. The first album they did with him, Master of the Rings, 1994, that did go back to and retain a lot of the classic Halloween elements that I lost, particularly on the Comedian album. And most importantly, Andy Darius had quite a lot of writing credits on this album, especially for being the new guy and all. He wrote one of the songs he wrote on his own. And there will be a lot more where that came from in the years to come. He quickly became, for a long time now, he's been the best and certainly the most prolific songwriter in Halloween. And he's been with the band for like 26, 27, 28 years or something. And as I'm sure you know, the Halloween in the last few years, they have brought back Michael Kiske and Kai Hansen to this big reunion thing. They're a 7-man band now. They call it Pumpkins United. And I don't know how many reviews and comments I've read in the last few years along the lines of, oh, why are Halloween still holding on to Andy Darius when Mike Kiske is back? It's like if Blaze Bayley would have stayed on when Bruce was back to Peggy. And that's really frustrating because those guys have not been paying any attention at all to what's been happening in Halloween for like 27 years. I mean, who did they think have been calling the shots all this time? Who did they think orchestrated and made this reunion thing happen? Who did they think wrote half the songs on the new reunion album? It's all there in the credits. I mean, weren't it for Andy Darius, there would have been no reunion. Halloween would have been long gone by now. So he definitely, he definitely came out with a unique voice, helped the band go on and build up some credibility again.
Yeah, and sometimes, and we'll probably see this as we go through this list, sometimes when a band has a sort of a signature successful album, it's hard. People just associate the band with, they remember that signature album. And even when another singer comes in, they can sometimes be in the band for 3 times as long as the other singer, but everybody still thinks that, oh, it's this original singer. And you're going to see that kind of with some of my picks. But all right, so I mentioned it, I'm doing a little bit more on the rock side of the picks here. So I'm going to go with when Phil Collins replaced Peter Gabriel. And Peter Gabriel was in Genesis, the original Genesis singer. Phil Collins at the time was playing drums. And although Phil Collins did occasionally sing on some numbers, it was really Peter Gabriel was the front man of the band. An amazing singer at that time. Genesis is more of a progressive rock, art rock, theatrical in some ways. Peter Gabriel would sort of dress up on stage and stuff like that. They did these sort of concept albums like The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Well, when Peter Gabriel left, I guess it made sense. Phil Collins had already sang a little bit in the band up to this point, here and there on some of the records. So it made sense, I guess, for Phil was there to just move him into the vocal slot, and they would go on the rest of Genesis's career with Phil Collins, I believe. I'm not super knowledgeable about Genesis. I've done Genesis as a band that comes up in a few of my videos. In fact, as of the recording of this, I have a music challenge where I'm listening to Selling England by the Pound 15 times, because I put Genesis down as one of these bands that I should like but don't like. So forgive me if I get their history a little bit wrong. But Phil Collins is definitely the guy when the average music listener thinks of Genesis, they think of Phil Collins, because at least here in the States, that era of the band was all over the radio. They were all over MTV. So as much as I prefer the Peter Gabriel era, and although I do like the sort of first couple Phil Collins albums because they still have a little bit of a progressive vibe to them, they hadn't quite turned completely over into a radio rock MTV pop band at that point, in those early Phil Collins records. With Phil coming over as a singer and them slightly changing their sound, they sort of start a whole new chapter in the band's career. And they're one of those bands, there's a lot of people that don't even know about the Peter Gabriel era albums. All they know is Land of Confusion and the videos and stuff on MTV. So there's my example of a singer coming in from a very strong singer, Peter Gabriel, very strong singer, and they had success with Peter Gabriel. They just never had that big sort of breakthrough international commercial success. And then when Peter Gabriel leaves, Phil Collins comes in, and they play around with the progressiveness for a little while, but then they eventually change, and then they become hugely popular. So, all right, what do you got for your second pick?
I was thinking of Metal Church. Metal Church also, much like Halloween, were actually bigger than you might think today. They weren't quite as big as Halloween, but they had everything going for them after 2 albums. They were signed to Elektra Records. They were out playing with Metallica and everything. They had established an identity for themselves and were pretty much on the verge of a bigger breakthrough. And at that point, you don't want to change the lead singer when you've already established an identity. But they did. The original singer was called David Wayne. I'm not sure to the exact reasons why they had to replace him, but I'm sure they wouldn't have done it if they didn't think it was absolutely necessary. So the first album of the new singer, Mike Howe, was Blessing in Disguise. It came out in 1989, and it wasn't really that drastic a departure from what they had done on the first 2 albums, but it's a bit more technical in places, and it's got a bit more scope. It has this huge, big epics like Badlands and Anthem of the Estranged. And I'm not going to say David Wayne couldn't have sung this album, because I'm sure he could have done, but Mike Howe certainly added some more color and some more possibilities to where they could go with the songwriting. And this was their most sold album, so I guess the audience approved. And they would continue to expand on the next few albums. The one after that was The Human Factor, and especially on the one after that, it's called Hanging in the Balance. I don't have that on vinyl, so I can't show it, but it's a great, very, very interesting album. They split up after that, at least for a good couple of years, but they had a great run on those 5 first albums, and I don't think it's possible for a thrash or power metal band to show a better progression over 5 albums than they did. And I think Metal Church is one of those rare cases. If you ask a random bunch of 100 fans who's the classic singer or the best singer for Metal Church, you're probably gonna get an even split between David Wayne and Mike Howe. I think that's pretty rare.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great. That's a great example of what we're talking about here. All right, I've got another 70s rock pick here. Journey. A lot of people don't even realize that the first couple Journey albums were more kind of instrumental, jazzy fusion, and the few vocals that might be there were done by Greg Rowley, the original keyboard player. Well, then this guy comes into the band, Steve Perry, and totally changes the trajectory of the band. The band had some modest success before this. You know, Neil Schon coming out of who did he? Carlos Santana's band. You know, Neil Schon was at Woodstock with Carlos Santana. But when Steve Perry comes into the band, it sends the band in a different direction, and especially when Jonathan Cain shows up on keyboards in the band. Jonathan Cain then would be instrumental in writing a lot of their biggest hits. But at this time, you still have Greg Rowley still singing some of the songs, with kind of co-singing with Steve Perry here, just the same way on this particular record. They sort of trade on and off. And but this is an example of, again, you know, the band having a certain level of success. Steve Perry and Greg Rowley is a great singer. It's just that Steve Perry is, you know, in my opinion, one of the greatest, you know, melodic rock singers of all time. So Steve comes in, and it just creates a whole new chapter in the band, in the band's career. And this is much like what I was talking about with Genesis. If you talk to the average Journey fan, who can probably name a bunch of their hits, radio hits and everything, they have no clue that there was this other phase in the band, you know, this instrumental, different singer phase. Everybody just assumes that Steve Perry, because he's so identifiable with the band, that he would be the singer that was there the whole time. And surprisingly, he wasn't. This is in the 70s. You could get away with your first couple albums being sort of all over the map a little bit before you found your sound. You know, bands sort of, sometimes their first couple records, they'd be searching for their sound before they really got there. And I think Steve Perry shows up, and of course, then he's with the band for quite some time. I know they've had a bunch of different singers after he left, but if you ask anybody, the first person they think of when you say Journey is Steve Perry. So, all right, that's my other classic rock take pick, Steve Perry coming into Journey. Okay, what do you got as your third pick?
Yeah, might be a bit too obvious, perhaps. But I was thinking of Queensryche. I mean, I just love early Queensryche, but they lost it. I think the last this is Promised Land. It's probably the last halfway decent record they made, and it came out in like 1994. So after that, I'm not gonna lie, I'm far from a scholar of the Queensryche catalog from the late 90s and the 2000s. I just know I don't care for that stuff at all, and I don't know anybody who does.
Yeah,
but I think you're gonna have to search high and low to find someone with much positive to say about those records. But there are a lot of them. And so basically, I hadn't cared for Queensryche in a long time. When I heard, when was this, 2011, 12 something, when they split with Jeff Tate, they were the original singer, the only singer they had up until that point. So I was like, oh great, a band with absolutely no credibility left, and now there's going to be some other guy up there singing whatever classic songs they still play. Any other good news, you know? But they brought in Todd Latour, or Latori, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, virtually unknown, but he had been singing some for Crimson Glory for a while. And they went out to play shows, and they played only stuff from the albums up until Empire, the 1990 albums. I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. Then when I heard the first piece of new music they recorded and released was a song called "Where Dreams Go to Die." It eventually was the opening song on their comeback album. I only have that on CD. It's self-titled. And I was just like, wow, so this is where they really want to be.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, where have you been all these years? And it's not like they invented a new wheel or anything. They just went back to the classic Queenstrike sound, which is obviously theirs and no one else's. And they've made 3 albums since, and I really like all of them. I think the last one, the Verdict, came out like 2 years ago or something. I think that's the strongest of the 3. So I'm really curious to hear what they're going to do next. That I mean, just the idea that I would be looking forward to new Queenstrike music, that's certainly not something I expected 10 years ago. So, so that's fun, and they might have some problems with the lineup credibility because they only have 2 original members left by now. I mean, obviously Jeff Tate, as great as he was obviously, he had been holding them back for quite some time. So good change, in my opinion.
Yeah, when you mentioned Queensryche, it made me think like this would be a good topic for another video, like bands who really lost their way but then came back, because this is a good example of this. From Promised Land on, you could even say after Empire, they just got confused, and I couldn't name those albums. At Promised Land is the last like Queensryche album that I'm sort of aware of, because it just got so sort of messy, and the whole thing with Jeff Tate, and it was just a mess. And then when they came back, they've come back and they've been consistent. They put out strong, consistent albums. Focus. It wasn't sort of this tangled mess of different things that they were trying to do towards the end of the Jeff Tate era. So maybe a topic for another video. All right, well, here we go. We're still in classic rock territory here, but we're getting a little bit harder, a little heavier. Van Halen, when Sammy Hagar comes in after David Lee Roth. I can't remember the video that I did where I was talking about how Sammy Hagar is technically the better singer than David Lee Roth, but David Lee Roth is a guy that has who oozes charm and charisma, and throw in his stage presence and all that kind of stuff to the band. But Sammy comes in, and this could have been a recipe for disaster. The band could have, fallen off the face of the earth. But Sammy, not an inexperienced singer, having his solo career in Montrose, comes in and confidently takes over the band. And I wouldn't say the band completely changes their sound, but the sound does shift a little bit more to kind of a radio hard rock. I mean, they were a lot of their songs for David Lee Roth got played on the radio, so I guess it's not fair to call it that. I don't really know how to maybe a little bit more structured with the Sammy Hagar era, where the David Lee Roth era always sounded like it was a big party in the studio when they recorded these records, that they were flying by the seat of their pants for those early David Lee Roth albums. Whereas with the Sammy Hagar albums, maybe it sounded a little bit more calculated, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And they had a tremendous amount of success, and Sammy was in the band for a while. I know he left. Gary Cherone was in the band briefly, but again, this is an example. Gary Cherone, even if you like that record, he wasn't in the band long enough for it to be any kind of successful run or anything. Really, after David Lee Roth, it's the run that they have with Sammy Hagar is sort of what keeps the band going. And in a lot of ways, they didn't lose a step after Dave. They were a stadium band with Dave, and they were a stadium band after Dave. They have a ton of David Lee Roth songs on classic rock radio. There's a bunch of Sammy songs that you can still hear on classic rock radio. So Sammy Hagar coming in for David Lee Roth. Okay, what's your next pick?
Sabotage. This is going to be a bit difficult to explain, but I'm gonna try my best. First, Sabotage is my favorite band, right? I mean, number one, undisputed. And John Oliva, the original singer for Sabotage, is my favorite singer of all time. In my mind, he can never be surpassed or matched. So that's where I come from with Sabotage. But they replaced John Oliva as singer in '92 or '93 after like a 10-year, 7-album career when they had really established an identity for themselves. And it was, I think, for a number of reasons. He had voice problems. He wanted to do some other music on the side, and I think they also wanted to try and find a singer with a less extreme, divisive voice that could be more commercially viable. So they brought in a guy called Zach Stevens, complete unknown, and he had a voice completely different from John Oliva's. It was smoother, much softer, and lower in range. He could still do the shrieks and sing most of the Sabotage catalog, but his own natural voice was completely different than John's. And the first album they did with him was Edge of Thorns, 1993. And this album for me is a perfect masterpiece from start to finish. It really brought the guitar back to the forefront for this album, and I love everything about it, including the vocal performance. I mean, I don't even need to think about the fact that he was replacing my favorite singer of all time, because the vocal performance is so stellar. Still, I can't say from this album only that the change of singer did the band good. That came later. I'm gonna try to explain that. Because only about 6 months after this album came out, Chris Oliva, the original guitar player and younger brother of John Oliva, he died in a car accident. He was killed by a drunk driver, and that was a huge, tremendous blow for the band, because he was unique. He really had his own style and was massively popular with the fans. So so that was a difficult situation. When you lose someone as unique as that, you're left with a lot of choices. Obviously, none of them might seem very good, but for my take on it, the worst possible choice that you can do is just try to replace him and try to pretend like nothing happened. Sabotage didn't do that. They did a number of things. John Oliva came back as full-time members, keyboard player and second singer. So they had 2 lead singers, and they brought in 2 lead guitar players instead of 1, and they started doing these huge epic concept albums like Dead Winter Dead, 1995, and The Wake of Magellan, 1997. They experimented with orchestration, counterpoint vocals, and everything. And when they played live, they mixed the old with the new. They did medleys, shook things up, alternated between the 2 singers. There was 2 lead singer band. And here's where it comes in, but that I think was a good idea to bring in Zach Stevens when they did, because when Chris Oliva died and they had to go through this massive change and uphill struggle, he was already established as a member of Sabotage. I think it would have been much more difficult to bring in another singer after the fact. That would have been weird and difficult. It was easier when he was already there, and they brought the old singer back to sing with him. So I think the fact that he was already there, they brought in another singer. They helped them stay relevant for another decade, basically. They did 4 more albums before they called it a day, and all of them are great. I think the career arc of Sabotage for me is unparalleled, because they have 12 albums, and each and every one of them brought something new to the table. And bringing in the new singer when they did helped to work towards that goal, definitely.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, there's a great example of, and kind of a unique situation, because like you mentioned with John Oliva, he was still involved with the band, he just sort of stepped back, off the vocal thing. And that's sort of a unique situation where he just sort of handed the mic over to somebody else. And it still sounds like Sabotage, but they went in a, they kind of had a slightly different direction that they started going in. And yeah, good example. All right, well, here's one from the world of classic hard rock, right? Maybe one of the biggest, singer changes of all time. Bon Scott tragically dies after the hugely successful Highway to Hell album. The band is, on their way to the top. Bon tragically dies. How do you replace a character like Bon Scott? Almost impossible to do. They bring in Brian Johnson and then turn around and release one of the greatest selling hard rock albums of all time. And the band would go on. A lot of times when you talk to AC/DC fans, I did a community poll thing on the YouTube channel, and I did a different singers. Who do you like better in these different bands? And Bon beat out Brian Johnson pretty handily, but there's no arguing that Back in Black is a massive, massive album. You could say that some of the later mid 90s AC/DC albums with Brian Johnson weren't as successful, but the band never really lost it. They became a stadium band with Back in Black. They were on their way to being a stadium band with Highway to Hell, but they got there and stayed there. And this Brian Johnson phase of their career, if anything, I think they've had a bit of a resurgence with the last so many albums, starting with Black Ice. They're a band that has remained relevant. When they put out a new album, everybody's talking about it. You see them all over TV. They get played on the radio. So this is one of the big singer changes of all time, in my opinion. And they were a really strong band with Bon Scott, and I'm sure they would have just kept going up and up with Bon. But when Brian comes in, it goes from strength to strength in a lot of ways. Brian, sometimes people say Brian is a similar singer to Bon, but I think fans know better than that. Brian's a different singer than Bon. He has a different style, a different way of writing lyrics and everything. And as much as I love the Bon Scott era and would probably choose that over the Brian Johnson era, there's no denying how incredibly successful the band has been since 1980 when Brian came into the band. Okay, I think we're at your last pick, right?
Yeah. The last example is Manila Road. And this is a bit of a stretch because it's not really a singer change. It's more like a singer replacement. But anyway, I realize not everybody might be familiar with Manila Road, but they were this quirky epic metal band in Wichita, Kansas in the 1980s. And their singer, guitarist, and main soul songwriter was Mark Shelton. And he had this really unique voice that's instantly recognizable, especially because of this nasal style of singing. And they split up or quit or were put on hold or whatever in the early 90s. And they made a comeback in the early 2000s. That was difficult because Mark Shelton had some pretty massive voice problems. Not only that he wasn't in shape or anything, but he had severely damaged his vocal cords. So singing was very difficult. So they brought in a new guy to help him sing. A guy called Brian Hellroadie Patrick. He was actually he'd been a roadie for Manila Road since the beginning, so hence the nickname Hellroadie. Mm-hmm. And he came in like a guy straight off the street and just sounded almost exactly like a young Mark Shelton. He came really close to imitating what Shelton did, including the nasal style. And it sounded great, but the first few years for Manila Road with Hellroadie singing was really tough because the fans were really aggressive and almost hateful towards Hell Roadie. Not so much because we sounded bad or anything, because he didn't, but it was more like it was more like for the way he acted on stage, although the fact that he wasn't Mark Shelton. Well, the first album he was singing lead on was Spiral Castle in 2002, and the one after that was Gates of Fire. There are a lot more albums, but this, the Gates of Fire is a near masterpiece, and it's the best album from modern day Manila Road, if you like. But it's not so much about the albums, although he does sing on them. It's about the live shows, really, that fans were being so hateful towards. And in their defense, the situation was kind of weird. It looked really peculiar because Mark Shelton was still in the band. He was he was on guitar. He would sing half the songs on the new records, and he always sung like 2 or 3 songs at every show, just for the hell of it, you know. So a lot of people were like, "Oh, why don't you sing all of it? We want to hear you sing like the old days. We don't care if your voice is what it used to be or whatever." But it was never really about that. It was just the fact that singing too much could potentially be very dangerous for his voice. It was already damaged. So singing full time just wasn't an option, whether he wanted to or not. So they soldiered on with Hell Roadie, and then the negative attitude that changed over the years, at least for the last 7 or 8 years they were active. Mark Shelton died in 2018, so they stopped then, obviously. For the last 7 or 8 years, fans were starting to be really appreciative of Hell Roadie, and appreciating the fact that he sounded so close to Mark Shelton, and that the band was able to continue make more music, play shows, go over to Europe on tour and play festivals. Because of him, they wouldn't have been able to do that without him. And yeah, I saw Manila Road in Europe 10 times, and they were always great. I have this great memory from I saw them in Oslo, Norway in 2009 or 10 or something. And they have, do you know the song Mask of the Red Death?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anyway, that song has not exactly a drum solo, but this drum part in the middle, and whenever they always played it, and Hell Roadie would always introduce the drummer to the audience when they came to that part. And he did that, and the drummer was going to break into the part, and he dropped his stick, the stick all over the stage. And Hell Roadie like dove to the floor to retrieve the stick and hand it back to. And you don't see a lot of lead singers. It's like in his mind, he was still
his roadie instinct kicked in.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm gonna do whatever they need me to do, whether it's retrieve a drumstick or sing the show. I'm there to do it, whatever.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I think he was a cool character and really helpful to Manila Road.
Yeah, that's a cool one. That's a great example. All right, well, the last one for me, this is one that I'm sure everybody would have brought up, is Bruce taking over for Paul Di'Anno. Paul Di'Anno, great singer, started with the first 2 albums with Iron Maiden, but there's no denying that Bruce comes into the band and the band explodes and goes to a whole entirely new level. The band would just go from strength to strength with Bruce through the 80s. Bruce would eventually leave in the 90s. Blaze Bayley would come in for 2 albums, but Bruce would be back, and he's been with the band since the early 2000s, I guess. So when did Brave New World come out? 2000, something like that. But they've had 2 very long, successful runs now with Bruce, and they're still running, with Bruce having just released an album a few weeks ago as the recording of this video. So there's no denying that you would classify this as a successful singer change. Although I do know some people that prefer the Di'Anno era much over they don't really like any of the Bruce stuff. They only like those first 2 records. But I think it's safe to say that Bruce had a successful run. It is still having a successful run with Iron Maiden. So, okay, well, there you go. Those are our picks for difficult singer changes that succeeded. So let us know in the comments down below what you think of our picks. Throw some of your own ideas down there. Again, these are hard singer changes that led to kind of a fairly long, successful new run for the band, maybe even sometimes a slight shift in the band with their sound or a little bit of a different direction or something. So let us know some of your picks down below in the comment section. I'd like to thank Per-Ola for coming here to the Lair again. Thank you. And I'm sure he'll be back because I love having him here. It's always great talking metal with him. And make sure you check out Lair the Alchemist, the Spotify podcast. And until we see you again, make sure you stay heavy, stay metal.